The Civil Rights Act had a lot to do with it, starting off with what it was. The Civil Rights Act ended segregation in public places, and the purpose of it was to end discrimination, and it was on the basis of sex, race, color, national origin, and even religion. This bill was passed by the 43rd United States Congress, a landmark United States Supreme Court decision confirming the constitutionality of racial segregation, even in public buildings, under the doctrine of separate but equal, setting up the Jim Crow laws in the South. In some events, where the same scenario happened on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her bus seat to a white person. 5 days later, a big number of African Americans heeded the call to stay off public buses in protest. African Americans, who made up 75% of bus riders in Montgomery, stayed off the buses for 381 days until the city made the law requiring segregation on public transport. At the trial, the NAACP argued that segregated schools sent the message to black children that they were lower class than whites, therefore the schools were naturally unequal. The Supreme Court struck down the separate but equal doctrine of plea for public education, ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, and required the desegregation of schools across America. Things were starting to get even worse even after the laws were issued. On September 2nd, 1957, the night before school was to start, Arkansas Governor Orville Fabius called out the state's National Guard to surround Little Rock Central High School and prevent any black students from entering. On September 25th, 1957, the 9 black students entered the school under the protection of 1,000 members of the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army who were called in by President Eisenhower. The Freedom Riders set out to challenge the Southern social norms by riding various forms of public transportation in the South to challenge local laws or customs that enforced segregation. A deal was finally made between the Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and Governor Ross Barnett, and Meredith was allowed to attend the university. On October 1st, 1962, he was allowed to enter after being barred on September 20th. The march is widely credited as helping to pass the Civil Rights Act 1964 and the Voting Rights Act 1965. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 piece of legislation that outlawed unequal application of voter registration requirements and racial segregation in schools, at the workplace, and by facilities that serve the general public. In 1965, the SCLC joined voting rights protest march from Selma, Alabama to the state capital of Montgomery, more than 50 miles away. The goal of the march was to draw national attention to the struggle for black voting rights in the state. Police beat and tear-gassed the marchers just outside of Selma. Malcolm X was an advocate for the rights of African Americans. He was a man who indicated white American in the harshest terms for its crimes against black Americans. While in prison, Malcolm X became a member of the Nation of Islam after his parole in 1952. He became one of the nation's leaders and chief spokesmen. Tensions between Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, head of the Nation of Islam, led to Malcolm X's departure from the organization in March 1964. The Black Power movement emphasized racial pride and the creation of black political and cultural institutions to nurture and promote black collective interests and advance black values. On Thursday, April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. had retreated to room 306 of the Lorraine Motel, worrying about sanitation strike in Memphis and working on his sermon for Sunday. On April 11, 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act, was meant as a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 prohibited discrimination in housing. There were no federal enforcement provisions. The 1968 Act expanded on previous acts and prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, and national origin. Thank you for listening, and that's the end.